Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. I stood frozen in the middle of our living room, my arms crossed tightly, the air heavy with an invisible weight that seemed to push in from every corner of the room. Another fight, just like all the others, a cycle of frustration that had worn us down. But something was different this time. It wasn't just anger coursing through me, it was something deeper. I had reached the end of the line I needed answers about. What had become of us? You don't even try anymore, I said, keeping my voice measured. It feels like none of this matters to you anymore. She didn't even lift her gaze from her phone, only letting out a sharp breath. The apathy in her reaction, unmistakable because it doesn't knot in the way you expected it to her. Words froze me for a moment. What do you mean by that? I asked, struggling to understand. She looked up at me, then her face devoid of expression. This marriage isn't anything more than a contract. Her statement hung in the air, and I couldn't respond right away. I needed a moment to process it. A contract, not a union built in love or shared commitment, but a legal agreement, an arrangement rooted in obligations. Is that really how you see it? I asked, forcing myself to remain composed. That's all it is. To you, she shrugged, her indifference cutting deep. What else could it be? We have responsibilities, bills to pay, chores to manage, appearances to uphold. That's marriage. You're acting like. I just said something shocking. She wasn't angry. She wasn't defensive. She was simply stating a truth. In her eyes, I should have been enraged, demanding answers about how long she had felt this way. But instead, I felt something else entirely. Clarity. I'd convinced myself for so long that the growing distance between us was temporary, something caused by stress, routine, or the grind of everyday life. I'd told myself that love was still there, buried under exhaustion, waiting to be reignited. But now I saw it for what it was. It had all been a lie she had never fought for. It's because she never believed there was anything worth fighting for. Do you even love me? The question slipped out before I could stop it, already dreading her response. She sighed heavily, rubbing her temples, like she had heard this all before. Why do you always ask about love, feelings, passion? Those things don't last. People get married for stability, not for fairy tales stability. That's all I had been to her, a dependable presence, a provider. The weight of that realization hit me like a punch, and with it something inside me shifted. Ed. I nodded slowly, trying to keep my composure. Okay. She looked at me, confusion flickering across her face. Okay. What? You're right, I said carefully, watching her. It is just a contract here. Yes, rolled as if she were finally seeing the light. About time, I exhaled, steadying myself. Yeah, I get it now. She thought she had won. She thought that I'd finally come around to her view of things, where love was irrelevant and marriage was merely a functional arrangement in her mind. The conversation was over. She had triumphed. But that was the mistake she made. She didn't realize that I had just shifted the terms of the contract. If it was just a contract, I'd treat it like one. And contracts, as Ike knew, could be terminated. I didn't bring it up again. There was no need to argue or make her realize the depth of what she had said. Instead, I let it sink in, allowing her words to etch away at the last remnants of my illusions about our marriage. She thought I had come to terms with her view, that I had accepted the idea of use as a business arrangement. In her mind, it was all settled. But that was where she was wrong. If this was a contract, I would treat it as such, and contracts could be broken. I began with the basics, the legalities, the finances, the obligations. Shared. I wasn't about to walk into this blindly. The first thing I did was find a lawyer, one specializing in complex divorces, someone who understood leverage and strategy, someone who could help me make a clean break without unnecessary fallout. I kept my plans to myself. There was no need to give her any warning, no reason to let her think I was anything other than the predictable husband she thought she knew. At night, while she scrolled through her phone in bed, I studied bank statements, property records, and every financial documented to us. I took note of everything: shared assets, debts, accounts. She controlled expenses. She managed. I analyzed her habits, her routines, and her vulnerabilities. She thought she was in control, but that was about to change. I watched her closely, now paying attention to things I had once overlooked. Now that I knew the truth, it all became clear. The avoidance of meaningful conversations, her dismissal of intimacy, the decisions she made without considering my feelings. For years I had made excuses as for her, telling myself that love showed itself in different ways, that not everyone was outwardly affectionate. But now I saw it clearly. She had never really cared, not in the way I did. One night she asked me to pick up something on my way home. A small routine request, simple and ordinary. But for the first time I saw it for what it was. Transaction. No warmth, no appreciation, just another item on her to-do list. I did it. Of course I kept up the appearance of being her husband, but inside I was already gone. I wasn't her partner anymore. I was just a man preparing to leave as my plan took shape. Life on the surface carried on as normal. The same routines, shared meals and silence, weekends spent running errands, conversations reduced to logistics. But with each passing day, I saw the truth more clearly. I revisited the past, examining moments I had once brushed aside, and now I could see the harsh reality beneath them. There were nights when I tried to talk about our future, about our dreams, our shared life. She would nod, distracted, her eyes distant, as if I were speaking about something trivial. When had my hopes become so important to her? I remembered reaching for her at night, yearning for the closeness we once had. Each time her body would tense and her excuses would pour out. I'm tired. Maybe tomorrow, not tonight. Or bed had become a symbol of the emotional chasm between us, two people lying side by side, miles apart. Holidays and anniversaries had become obligations rather than celebrations. I planned special evenings, bought thoughtful gifts, and made her favorite meals. In return, I received only a detached thanks or a distracted smile as she scrolled through her phone. It dawned on me these gestures, once meant to nurture our bond, had become mere checkboxes to take kickoff. I began to notice how she acted around others in public. She was the perfect partner. Charming, affectionate presence. She laughed at my jokes, held my hand, leaned in close, but behind closed doors, the mask would fall. Affection turned to cold indifference or thinly veiled irritation. Her warmth had been nothing more than a performance, an act for the world, to maintain the illusion of a perfect marriage. Even our arguments weren't about resolving anything or understanding one another. They were about power control tactics to remind me of my place in this supposed contract. Every time I allowed myself to be vulnerable, she would dismiss it as overreaction, twisting the narrative until I questioned my own feelings. Gaslighting, I realized it had been her weapon all along. The more I observed them, or the patterns became undeniable. Her focus had always been squarely on her own interests, her career, her social standing, her personal ambitions. My accomplishments were met with little more than a half-hearted acknowledgement, often accompanied by a quiet reminder to stay in my place. But when I stumbled, it was an inconvenience to her, an unwelcome disruption to the perfect world she had meticulously crafted. What struck me the hardest, though, was how long it took me to see the truth. I had confused her detached practicality for partnership, her emotional withdrawal for independence, and her manipulative strategies for genuine care. In truth, she'd been designing this arrangement as a business deal long before it was ever spoken aloud. Sitting in our home, the weight of this realization grew heavy on me each moment. Of her emotional coldness, every calculated decision served as undeniable proof that whatever we once had was long gone. It wasn't just a matter of navigating legalities or finances. It was a conscious act of fortifying myself, breaking down the emotional walls she had built to keep me contained. By the time I was ready to confront her, any love I'd once held had long since faded, replaced with something colder and unshakable resolve. This wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the reclamation of my dignity, a refusal to remain passive in the game she had so carefully orchestrated each day. I watched her move through life with calculated detachment, managing our shared existence like an executive, overseeing a portfolio. And with every passing day, I became more certain of my next move. This contract she had so eagerly embraced was coming to an end, not in a courtroom, but through the quiet dissolution of the lies that had kept it intact. Weeks of planning had passed. Every document was in order. Every step, meticulously thought out. The legal side of things had been handled with precision. And when the moment came, I would be the one in control. She had reduced our marriage to a mere transaction stripped of emotion and meaning. Now I was ready to show her the consequences of such a structured timing. Was everything I needed her to feel. Secure, unaware, if there was one thing I'd learned about her over the years, it was that she couldn't bear to lose control. I wanted her to experience in the most pragmatic way possible. What happens when a contract no longer benefits both parties, so I waited that night. She was in the kitchen scrolling through her phone while leaning casually against the counter. She wore her usual, indifference-like armor blissfully, unaware of what was about to transpire. I placed the neatly organized documents on the table between us. She didn't even glance up at. First, what's that? She asked, her attention still on her phone. I pulled out a chair, sitting down calmly. It's what you wanted. She looked up, her brow furrowing as she scanned the papers. What are you talking about? You said this marriage was just a contract. I pushed the papers toward her. I'm terminating it. Her fingers hesitated, her phone slipping out of her grip for a second. For the first time in ages, I saw something other than her usual indifference, perhaps confusion, maybe even discomfort. She set her phone down. Wait, what? She asked, her voice faltering. I tapped the papers gently. Divorce, legal, separation, asset division. Everything is laid out here. My tone remained steady, devoid of emotion. I had a lawyer go over. It's fair and efficient, just like a contract should be. She stared at me, searching my face for any hint that I might be bluffing. There was none. You already spoke to a lawyer, her voice was no longer sure. I did. I didn't flinch as she flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the terms. Bank accounts, property, debts, and responsibilities, everything was accounted for. You're serious, she said, her voice flat, more of a statement than a question. I leaned forward, just slightly. Of course I'm serious. This is what you wanted. Write a structured agreement, no emotions, no illusions. I watched her closely, my gaze unyielding. You made it clear this marriage was just a contract. I'm just making it official. Her jaw tightened. That's not. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. You're overreacting. No, I corrected her. I'm reacting appropriately. She leaned back, arms crossed, clearly trying to regain control. And you expect me to sign this just like that? I shrugged. It's up to you. We can settle this quietly, or we can drag it through the courts. Either way, this is over. She laughed, short and incredulous. You're really doing this? She reached for the papers again, but this time I noticed it, the way her fingers tightened around the edges, the shift in her expression from disbelief to something colder. This was the moment she realized she had lost her grip on the situation. She set the papers down again, her gaze fixed on mine as though trying to regain some semblance of control. This is because you're angry, you're being petty? I shook my head. No, I'm just finally listening to you. I added, my tone calm. Her lips pressed into a thin line. You're making a mistake. I stood, pushing my chair back with deliberate calm. No, the mistake was ever thinking this marriage was anything more than a transaction. I turned to leave, leaving her alone with the papers, the very contract she had set in motion. Long before I formalized it, she didn't sign them immediately. I wasn't surprised for someone who had always treated this marriage as a business arrangement. She suddenly hesitated when confronted with terms that no longer suited her. In the days that followed, the silence in our home felt heavier. It wasn't just the quiet of two people coexisting without truly engaging. It was a silence thick with unspoken tension, as if something monumental was on the verge of unfolding. I could see her mind working, strategizing, trying to figure out how to regain control, how to reverse the situation in her favor, but it was already too late. She had lost 2 nights later. She tried to deny it at dinner. She casually suggested plans for the weekend, as if nothing had changed. We should probably make a reservation for Saturday, she said, her voice light, almost carefree. I didn't look up from my laptop. I won't be here on Saturday. She paused, clearly caught off guard. What do you mean? I finally met her eyes. I meant exactly what I said. This is happening. Her expression flickered briefly, but she quickly masked it with a shrug. You're being dramatic. I exhaled, slowly closed my laptop with a quiet click. Dramatic. No, I'm being efficient. You, on the other hand, seem to be struggling with your own logic. She crossed her arms, trying to maintain her composure. So you're just going to throw everything away? I shook my head. You already did. She had no retort to that. 2 days later, she shifted to a different tactic negotiation. She slid the papers back across the kitchen table, tapping her nails against the surface. "These terms don't work for me," she said, her voice controlled, calculating. I leaned back in my chair, unbothered. "They're fair," she scoffed. "Fair? You think this is fair?" "Yes," I answered flatly, "and if you don't, we can let the lawyers handle it, but this is no longer up for discussion." Her jaw tightened, but she knew as well as I did that there was no negotiating left. "Are you truly going to make this harder than it needs to be?" I studied her intently, letting the silence stretch out between us. "There's no easier way," I answered softly. "There's just the truth." I could see her frustration build the way she fought to maintain a shred of control. This was uncharted territory for her. For years, she'd convinced herself that she held the upper hand, that I'd always be the one making concessions, adjusting to fit her world, striving to keep things together. Not anymore. The next move was inevitable, and I knew exactly what it would be. The blame game. That night, she didn't bother to pretend to stay calm or logical. She was seething. "You're a coward," she hissed. "You stand for nothing. You just bail when things get tough." I let out a dry, humorless laugh, bitter but silent. "I fought for this marriage longer than you ever did." She shook her head violently, pacing back and forth, her movements sharp and erratic. "You're just trying to hurt me," she accused, her voice tight with fury. "This isn't about us. It's about your ego." I stood up slowly, every motion deliberate, signaling that the conversation was over. "You've already made your position clear," I said, my voice steady and resolute. "I'm simply giving you exactly what you wanted." She opened her mouth, no doubt ready to fire back, but the words never came. We both knew the reality now. For all those years, she'd believed she could call all the shots, that I would always stay, no matter how distant she became, no matter how little she gave in return. She was wrong. The bargaining was done. She didn't say another word as I started gathering my things. No protests, no frantic pleas to make me stay, not even a weak attempt to change my mind. She just stood there, arms crossed, her face a mask of controlled indifference. But I understood what was happening. She was struggling with the loss of the power she had always held over me, the very dynamic that had kept us tied together now unraveling in front of her eyes. I moved methodically, taking only what was mine: clothes, papers, a few personal items that held meaning. There was no rush, no frantic shoving of things into bags. This wasn't a hasty escape. It was a decision executed with the same precision she had always demanded. She sat on the edge of the bed, observing. As I zipped up my suitcase, "So this is it?" he asked, her voice barely audible. I glanced at her, tightening my grip on the suitcase. "Handle what else is left to say?" She exhaled sharply, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're really just walking away?" I looked at her, taking a long, measured glance at the woman I had once believed I knew, the woman with whom I'd built my life, the one I had fought so hard to understand. But now, for the first time, I saw her clearly. Someone who'd taken and never given back. "You already left," I said quietly. "I'm just catching up." Her jaw tightened, but she stayed silent. I dragged the suitcase toward the door, pausing for a brief moment before stepping outside. I turned to face her one final time. Not with anger, not with resentment, but with a sense of closure. "You were right," I said. "Marriage is just a contract." She stared at me, waiting for some last-minute apology, some flicker of regret, some hint that I might change my mind, but I gave her none of that. I walked out the door, and this time, I wasn't coming back, my friend, and this is the end of the story.